for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
It is with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this CBC Special Order Hour with Member Chair Horsford, the chairman of the CBC, and Ms. Kamlager of California. For the next 60 minutes, we have a chance to speak directly to the American people on issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, the constituents we represent, and all Americans. Tonight, we will be speaking on the death of Tyre Nichols. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Speaker, I yield to myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today after the horrifying murder of yet another young black man at the hands of police, outraged because nothing has worked. They need more police training, we said, but so-called elite squads like Scorpion already require extra training over and above the basics. They need more diversity, we said, but every single one of the 5 officers we saw mercilessly beat an unarmed and compliant Tyre Nichols was black just like him. They need more accountability, we said, but even the advent of body cams hasn't stopped officers from pummeling our sons and sometimes our daughters to death over mere traffic infractions. Just throw in a few shouts of "stop resisting" to try and fool our eyes from believing what we're clearly seeing. We tried all those things, more training, more diversity, more accountability, and yet Tyre Nichols is dead. He was dragged out of his car and attacked by a swarm of men twice his size, exhausting themselves, and then coming back to beat him again. Reforming these so-called elite squads is not enough. It's time to end them altogether. These units often attract and recruit young, aggressive officers drawn to the prospect of less supervision. They slap an intimidating name onto the team, like Scorpion or Stress or Crash, which in the 90s stood for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, because these units aren't about forging bonds with the communities they serve. They're about instilling fear. They descend on low-income, usually minority neighborhoods, looking to make pretextual stops in search of drugs or guns. That's not a secret. It's a tactic sanctioned by the Supreme Court itself. An officer can stop anyone for whatever reason he wants. He doesn't even need to know which law he suspects you of breaking, so long as he can develop a reason after the fact. Reasons that are often minor, trivial, and unrelated, like a busted taillight, or a partially obscured traffic tag, are sufficient for these stops. This is a formal policy in police departments across the country. For example, the New York City Police Department admittedly trained its officers to, quote, "stop and question first, develop reasonable suspicion later," close quote. What results is a constant state of alert. Black and brown males worry about being pulled over for a minor traffic stop that can spiral out of control. Police officers worry because they are understandably taught that there is nothing more dangerous than to walk up to a stranger's driver's side window at night. Both sides of the confrontation are on edge. And for what? So that an officer can peek inside the car for contraband and ask for so-called consent to search the car, despite many drivers feeling like they can't say no. These pretextual stops aren't bearing much fruit. A study found that stop and frisk searches in New York City produce drugs or guns in less than 2% of the cases. What it does breed is contempt between the police and the people they're sworn to protect. African Americans are 5 times more likely to have their vehicles searched, and a black man has to hit the age of 50 before his chance of being pulled over lowers to that of a young white man. As the father of 5 black sons, I'm all too familiar with the talk parents are duty-bound to give their black and brown children about how to de-escalate interactions with the police. As a former prosecutor, I saw firsthand how communities can be ravaged by fear in the face of violent crime and threats to public safety, but those communities should not also be afraid of the men and women in uniform whose job it is to defend them. Police can't investigate crime if victims and witnesses don't trust them enough to come forward. These squads running roughshods on our streets are contributing to a breakdown in that trust. It isn't leading to better results, but it is contributing to the unjustified killing of our kids. The Memphis police chief, Sarah Davis, did the right thing by shutting down the Scorpion unit, but we must not wait until the next murder of an innocent man gets national attention before we shut down these roving elite squads across the country. Professor Christy Lopez, the co-chair of the DC Police Reform Commission, made the case brilliantly in a recent Washington Post editorial entitled, "Cities Should Get Rid of These Toxic Crime Units," which I will now submit to the record. Finally, I think the time has come to end pretextual stops completely. Because they are just racial profiling hiding behind legalese and little more than a subtle way to circumvent the constitutional rights of low-income black and brown males. Pretext stops allow police to stop cars, even though they lack even reasonable suspicion to think an actual crime is, has been, or is about to be committed. They allow police to pressure drivers into so-called consensual searches so that they can avoid the need to obtain a warrant to search the car. And as we've seen yet again, these pretextual stops frequently escalate into young men being killed or seriously injured, not because they broke the law, but because they've been targeted for aggressive police tactics that aren't directed at other communities. So I urge President Biden to use his executive authority to put an end to this practice at the federal level. And I urge state and local officials, mayors, police chiefs, county executives to put an end to this practice all over the country. I now recognize the Congresswoman from California, Ms. Sydney Kamlager.
Thank you. It is with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this CBC Special Order Hour. It is the first of the 118th Congress and my first in this body. We have a problem, America, a big problem. The problem is the rampant disregard for black life at the hands of law enforcement. For too many years now, we have seen snuff videos, death at the hands of police, of our black men and women, our black boys and girls. These videos become dissected, the victim in death is persecuted as a way to justify excessive force, and it goes on and on and on. The more this happens, the more desensitized we become. And as a culture, we enter into a culture of deflection, deflecting accountability, deflecting truth, deflecting uncomfortable conversations about the value of black life. Why are we always looking for the perfect victim in these circumstances? If they were perfect, if any of us were, they wouldn't be victims. They also probably wouldn't be victims if they weren't black. We certainly spend a lot of time victim blaming, deflecting, not talking about the kind of public safety all of us should have and how we reimagine it in a way that makes it safe for everyone. It is sad to say, but police shootings in black communities has become as American as baseball. In baseball, you have something called balks. Pitchers commit balks, and the lower the balk number, the better your success. In law enforcement, we also have something called balks, although it means something different. B, background, A, age, L, lethal force, K, knowledge, S, seriousness of a crime. And once again, the lower the number of deaths, the higher the use of bulks, something American, something we should be discussing. How can we incorporate bulks more deeply into our public safety system so that all lives can be saved? What we are seeing with these shootings is un-American. I would also argue that it is unconstitutional because shootings like this are equivalent to summary executions. Law enforcement has become judge, jury, and executioner. Meanwhile, the 14th Amendment declares that we all have a right to due process. But these shootings have stolen due process from so many men and women in our Black communities. These videos, once again, that we see, the images, as horrific as they are, have become symbols of today and what Black America has to experience. You know, the symbols of today become the reality of tomorrow. And the recordings of these shootings are important because they keep us honest, but they also become symbols of police brutality, police violence. We've gotten used to these symbols, and that's a problem. This is Black History Month, but you would be flawed in thinking that the issue of police shootings and police violence is a Black issue, or that it's not an issue because it's not happening in your community. It is an American issue, and it must be addressed. I think we should be talking more deeply about the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act and how we reimagine law enforcement. When law enforcement officers are trained to understand and take all of these pieces into account, we see much better outcomes of police interaction. Once again, I would just like to share some of the symbols that are propelling us towards the values of tomorrow. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, we must carry their memories with us as we fight to address the epidemic of police violence. We have an obligation to the family of Tyre Nichols, beaten to death in Memphis, to the family of Takar Smith, shot 7 times by the LAPD while on his knees, to the family of Oscar Leon Sanchez, cornered and shot while suffering a mental health crisis, to the family of Anthony Lowe, shot in the back multiple times by LAPD, I might add, a double amputee and someone living in a wheelchair, and to the family of Keenan Anderson, tased to death during a routine traffic stop. I am honored that Dominique Hamilton, Keenan's fiance, will join me tomorrow for the 2023 State of the Union address. As one of the far too many people impacted by police brutality in 2023 alone, her bravery shines through. I hope that we can all take inspiration from her and all of the families of those killed at the hands of police this year. We must do more to hold our law enforcement officers accountable and stop this epidemic of state-sanctioned murder. Thank you, and I yield back my time to Congressman Ivey.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield to my colleague, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas.
Let me thank the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Maryland, Congressman Ivey, and the distinguished gentlelady from the great state of California, Congresswoman Kahn-Lager-Dove, for their leading such an important special order. Let me also thank Chairman Horsford for immediately capturing the pain and sentiment of the American people. And when I say that, I am speaking of all of the American people, Mr. Speaker, because I believe more than any part of our constitutional rights, the right to be free and safe in this nation is one that Americans crave for. No matter whether they are in the beauty of Utah, in the richness of Mississippi, in the smart urban life of New York, on the beauty of the West Coast, Republican or Democrat, independent, and any other affiliation, We are concerned about safety. And the reason is because safety involves the coming and going of our family members, our children. For any of us who've ever been parents, we have always had with a little trepidation when that little one leaves the home for the first time in that pre-K or kindergarten, that they would be safe. We are appalled at the unsafe conditions that we've faced in our schools today. Uvalde, Sandy Hook, Santa Fe, and beyond. We know that violence permeated those safe spaces. At the same time, I think, as I thank the Congressional Black Caucus for its recognition that as it speaks here on the floor today, it is embracing an American issue, public safety. I will be looking for Republicans that are going to admit that even as we want those who protect and serve to go home to their families, we cannot deny American mothers and fathers the right to expect their young people to come home. And we can walk, if I might say, and chew gum at the same time. We can uplift the urgency of importance of law enforcement at all levels, first responders, EMTs, firefighters, as I do, a member of the Fire Caucus, former chair of the Crime Committee, now ranking member. We have worked in the House Judiciary Committee and worked with the Congressional Black Caucus on major legislation that deals with answering all of those concerns. I would be remiss to think that there are not Republicans who will not join us in this whole idea of crafting a 21st century approach to police-community relations. There is no one that could in any way accept the murder of a man on the streets in video, as was my constituent's brother. Felonious Floyd is here, and he will join me at the State of the Union. His brother, George Floyd, Big George, who grew up in CUNY Homes, was everybody's friend. Their mother and their family was everybody's family. They opened their doors to children who may not have a good hot meal, and they gave it to them. And yet, like every American who leaves their hometown and looks for a greener space, as what he looked at in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he found a deadly end. No one could accept that, and the reason, Mr. Speaker, that I know that is because the people who took to the streets nonviolently and walked shoulder to shoulder with us were from all walks of life. And out of that was crafted a combination of Republican-supported ideas, things that were embraced in the Trump executive order, now embraced in the Biden executive order, dealing with a reconstruct of police-community relationships, which would include the idea of making sure that random stops that caught Tyre Nichols in the throngs of violence that lasted for an hour on videotape, or the tragedy of Breonna Taylor, or the tragedy of Eric Garner, or the tragedy in the early stages under color of law, Trayvon Martin, in someone who was supposed to be a civil patrol, and a young boy lost his life, or the young boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who lost his life at age 12 or 13 years old, or the cafeteria worker who lost his life, or Pam Turner, who lost her life, or Sandra Bland, who lost her life. And so we can construct, under the Constitution, a reasonable response to traffic stops included in the early premise of legislation. We can deal with the right way to, in essence, address a human being and chokeholds when you are not in danger, basically, are without place. No knocks that come to, in essence, a wrong person's home, or someone entering the wrong home. All of that is reasonable to deal with in a new construct of which we hope President of the United States will join us in a bipartisan, bicameral effort. And that would include training as well, accountability as well. It would include dealing with mental health concerns or violence intervention, as well as the necessity of wearing body cams, which were the element of truth and have been. I was very proud in the small cities that I represent, Mr. Speaker, to be able to provide grant money for our cities to get body cams, small cities that don't have it. Just think if we pass legislation that allows all departments to seek body cams for truth for all that are involved. And so I rise today to capture the essence of the importance of this Congressional Black Caucus special order, because it is laying the footprints for the day tomorrow, as the President speaks to the nation on many issues. But there is no doubt, as someone who went to the funeral of Tyre Nichols, as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, to be able to say that we can do this together. Public safety is an American issue. It is American families' issue. It is the issue of those who are entrusted to protect and serve. It is the issue of local government, state government. It's the issue of moms and dads. It's the issue of teenagers and young families and senior citizens. It does not leave one person untouched. And I believe that the work that was done in the last years with legislation that carried the name of George Floyd has the ability to embrace a wide perspective of diversity and new changes and inspiration, and of course working as one would with all persons concerned and even respecting the other body. But the Congressional Black Caucus has taken up the light, and I'm grateful for that leadership and look forward that we continue to work, because we are not the nation of laws and values if we do not adhere as a nation that every person deserves the dignity of their humanity and does not deserve, under the Constitution, to be denied their equal protection of the law, their due process in the workings between law and community. So I thank my very important co-leaders of the special orders. I wish them well. I know that they will be a dynamic team. I had the privilege of doing this in the last session, and I can tell you, you will have a moment of joy every time you rise to this floor and are joined by the esteemed members of the Congressional Black Caucus, each and every one of them with their own special story, and we do make a difference, and we can change lives, and we can change laws. With that, I yield back to the distinguished gentleman.
Thank you, and I would like to thank the distinguished gentlelady for her powerful and extemporaneous comments. I think it's a representation of the powerful leadership she's provided over the years and will continue to provide in the future. Now I would like to yield to my colleague, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Stephen Horsford of Nevada.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, it is an honor to join my colleagues of the Congressional Black Caucus on the floor tonight for what is the first special order hour of the 118th Congress. I want to first acknowledge our chairs for special orders this evening, the gentleman from Maryland, Congressman Glenn Ivey, and the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Sidney Kamlager-Dove. This hour provides all of us as members an important opportunity to come to the floor and to discuss issues vital to Black Americans. And we will use that time to do just that tonight. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow, during the State of the Union, it is my hope that President Biden will be able to put a personal touch on the story of Tyre Nichols. The brutal beating of Tyre Nichols resulted in his death, and it is a reminder that we have a long way to go in solving systemic police violence in America. We and his parents want America to know who Tyre was. Tyre was a son. He was a father. He loved skateboarding and sunsets. He enjoyed photography. He had a purpose and a passion and a lifelong opportunity ahead of him, but that was taken. Now, no one in our nation should fear interacting with the police officers in any of our communities. Sadly, many black and brown people do every single day. I want to be absolutely clear. We all want to be safe, and we want our communities to be safe. We don't want to end policing. We want to stop bad policing. All of us should agree that bad policing has no place in any community in America. That is why we need to address the public health epidemic of public safety that disproportionately affects our communities. I want to commend our colleague, Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, who issued this statement, and I quote, "We have been here too many times before, and we cannot continue down this path. This man was beaten by the power of the state, by men entrusted with protecting his safety. We must unite against this blatant disregard for human life, especially from those whom have been trusted with immense power and responsibility for our communities," unquote. Mr. Speaker, Democrats and some Republicans agree. This is an important issue that must be addressed. Something must change to prevent further unnecessary deaths. In the coming weeks, my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus and I are engaging with leaders in our community and right here in the U.S. Capitol. We are working with the President, with the Vice President, with the Senate, and our House colleagues on the issue of public safety, policing, and justice, which is what we need action on now. For every mom, dad, son, and daughter, it's imperative that we tackle this issue with legislative solutions, with executive actions, and community-based results. That is how we put an end to the pattern of black lives being taken at the hand of law enforcement, whether it is during a traffic stop, walking in a park, or sleeping in their home. So again, thank you to my colleagues that are here on the floor with us to speak tonight, and thank you to Representatives Ivey and Kamlager-Dove for leading on this effort of special order tonight and for the work that we will continue to do in the days, weeks, and months to come. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your commitment and your strength on this issue. I would now like to yield to my colleague, Representative Moore, the gentlewoman from Wisconsin.
Thank you so very, very much. And I want to thank the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Horsford, and of course, our esteemed colleagues who are leading this special order, Ms. Representative Kamlager-Dove of California and Representative Glenn Ivey of Maryland. This is extremely important work in terms of communicating to our constituents. Tonight, I'm standing here in February feeling like this is like not just Black History Month, but this is like Groundhog Day. The death of Tyre Nichols is yet another preventable death, a homicide committed by those who are hired to protect us, those who are hired to protect and serve as a mission. And you know, this is this is not an issue that can be resolved through just, hiring more diverse officers or merely providing more training. It really requires us to take a deep dive and look at the role that law enforcement plays in our community, the relationship that law enforcement has with our community, and get a better understanding of what those needs are and how those needs are not being met. And that is why the Congressional Black Caucus in both the House and the Senate have introduced the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act, because we recognize the familiar fact patterns. Although Tyre Nichols is one of the most recent incidences, it's the same fact pattern. You know, pretextual stops. We have no idea at this point why Tyre Nichols was stopped. That there's bias in these stops, bias against men of color, excessive force, failure to exercise de-escalation strategies, and of course, qualified immunity, really creating no incentive for police officers to exercise good judgment and to use legal police tactics. And, you know, this problem, we've heard there are a lot of famous people who have been subjected to this police brutality, and we've heard some of those names tonight, but I just want to talk about my district. I want to talk about my community in Wisconsin. We've seen this devastation firsthand. Since 2013, 149 people in Wisconsin have been killed by violence, and with nearly all of them being shot by police officers. It's a systemic issue when it comes to police departments. People who face mental health crises, traffic violations, or nonviolent offense should not be given the death penalty. Those like Joel Acevedo, who was murdered by an officer, or 17-year-old Alvin Cole, who was shot by police after leaving the mall, or 18-year-old Tyrese West, who was killed after police stopped him for not having a light on his bicycle, and 19-year-old Terry Williams, who was shot 8 times after a traffic stop, or 22-year-old Adam Trammell, who was killed in his home by police, who tasered him 18 times while he was in the shower. And 23-year-old Seville Smith, who was shot by police even after the police saw him throw his weapon away. How about 25-year-old Jay Anderson Jr., who was sitting in a parked car and was shot 5 times in the head? And a person that I actually don't understand why he is dead would have turned 40 years old, January 20th, but 9 years ago, Dontre Hamilton was shot 14 times. And what was his crime? He was asleep on a public Milwaukee County park bench, unarmed. One group of cops came by, did a wellness check, saw that he was fine. Another cop came by, beating him with his baton, and when Dontre disarmed him, when 140-pound Dontre Hamilton disarmed the cop, he was shot 14 times. That police officer retired with his pension and his disability benefits for having PTSD for killing Dontre Hamilton. And guess what? Beyond those who are killed by the police, we have others who survived their violent encounters with those entrusted with public safety, but they're nonetheless scarred, like Jacob Blake in Kenosha, or my guest tomorrow for the State of the Union address, NBA basketball player Sterling Brown. Sterling Brown was an arrogant black man, I guess, who parked in a handicapped spot about 2 o'clock in the morning to go into Walgreens to get some medication. And when he came back out, the police saw his fancy car there, very consistent with his status as a high-paid individual, and asked him why he was parked at 2 a.m. within an empty parking lot in a handicapped spot. And what did Sterling Brown say? "Officer, just give me a ticket." And that led to him being tased, gun drawn on him, and the Wisconsin, Milwaukee taxpayers paying for the insult. This driving while black in a fancy car, this uppity Negro, and there was no de-escalation of police. And so this is why the Congressional Black Caucus will consistently come to this well, Mr. Speaker, and insist that we look at the elements of the George Floyd Justice Act, because I will tell you, being black is not a crime, and therefore it should not be a death sentence. And I would yield back to you, Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you for that powerful statement. I would like to yield to Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you, Representative Ivey. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
24 minutes.
Thank you. I would now like to yield to my colleague, Representative Johnson, the gentleman from the 4th District of Georgia.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I thank her, along with Congressman Ivey, for leading this special order hour on behalf of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of Chairman Steve Horsford. And tonight we are here to talk to you about a plague on America. It has to do with police violence towards black people in this country. And I'm not talking about just white police officers, but black officers also. We saw it with Tyre Nichols, a group of 5 so-called elite crime suppression unit officers who travel in unmarked cars and in plain clothes, and they're out looking for crime. And they jump out on folks. And they jumped out on Tyre Nichols. He was on his way over to his mother's house for dinner, but he never made it. And y'all saw it on TV where he was pulled over. The police were going at 100 miles an hour on him. Get out of the car, get out of the car, had guns drawn. Get on your stomach. And he complied. But because of the culture of policing with these crime suppression units and other units of police agencies across the country, he was frightened. I was frightened. He ran, and he almost made it to his mother's house, but they caught up with him, and the rest you saw with your own eyes. You can believe your lying eyes about what you saw, a horrific beating. And you also could hear what was happening in the background as the officers were talking to each other, planning on how they were going to adjust their reports to all be consistent about this guy being on drugs, and he must have been on this, that, and the other. He wouldn't comply. He wouldn't put his hands behind him. You know, just talking to each other throughout the whole thing. This is a part of a culture, and it's something that has to be rooted out. It's happening all over the country. In my neck of the woods, DeKalb County, 2015, March, an Air Force veteran, Anthony Hill, had been to Afghanistan. His mother didn't want him to go, but he went to serve his country, and he came back. He was different, suffering from mental illness, bipolar. So in March of 2015, shortly after the situation with Michael Brown in Ferguson, shortly after that, Anthony Hill is out in his apartment complex running around naked as a jaybird, swinging from canopies, knocking on doors. The neighbors knew him. They called the police. They called 911. They wanted some help to come for him. But instead, a police officer showed up. And when Anthony Hill did not stop coming towards the officer, he didn't tase him. He didn't hit him with his nightstick. He pulled out his 9mm, shot him twice, killed him. That was his mother's only son, her youngest child. He killed him. He was naked as a jaybird. And then he said in his report that the guy came at him and hit him, and that's why he fired. But the jury found otherwise. The officer was indicted for murder, but the jury didn't convict him for murder. They convicted him for aggravated assault and for lying, filing a false statement about what happened. Took the jury 6 days to get to the point where they could convict him of anything. And he was looking at 30 years at that point, but the judge had mercy on him, gave him 20 to do 12 for taking the man's life. And that's how it goes throughout America. Everybody has sympathy, and I have abundant sympathy, and I love my men in blue, men and women in blue. But the culture of policing has to change. We saw why it needs to change with Tyre Nichols. And my colleagues are going to come with other examples of why it needs to change. I've given you mine. I've taken enough of your time, but I'll just leave it with this. We need to make police reform a priority. It's time to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We did it in the House 2 or 3 times last session. Went to the Senate, couldn't get across the finish line. So we need the Senate to abandon the filibuster rule. And let's get some legislation passed, let's get voting rights passed, and let's get police reform passed. And with that, I'll yield back to my colleagues.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
Minutes.
Thank you. I would like to yield to my colleague, Representative Payne of New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I first want to thank Chairman Horsford for bringing this forth, this special order hour, and the gentleman from Maryland and the gentlelady from California for chairing this order hour. This special order hour focuses on the problem of police brutality, especially in Black and brown communities. And I welcome the opportunity to raise awareness for an issue that is so close to so many in my community. To the family of Tyre Nichols, I once again send my heartfelt condolences for your tragic loss. In the wake of the release of that horrifying footage that the world watched of yet again another despicable display of police brutality in this country, our cities and streets have been plagued for decades by this senseless and unnecessary use of force by sworn officers of the law. And it has permeated the facets of Black and brown lives. In the last 10 years alone, my state of New Jersey has been home to 109 excessive force lawsuits against officers and police departments since 2012. And because of that number, I could not give you the names that were involved in these situations. As I said, 109. The profession of policing should not be costing states and local taxpayers millions of dollars each year in settlements for wrongful acts caused by those entrusted to protect and serve. I voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was legislation that would end racial profiling in law enforcement, ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants, and establish a federal standard for policing in and against African American communities. The calling card for such a bill came after thousands of Americans took to the streets in the summer of 2020 to protest the brutal murder of George Floyd and other African Americans from policing violence. For too long, many Americans were considered dangerous and violent simply because of the color of their skin. We have been witness for some time now that police officers have been allowed to violate the sanctity and privacy of African Americans while in their cars, homes, or even standing on the sidewalk. The time is now for us to create a nationwide standard for police conduct to stop police brutality against African Americans and other minorities. This is a day we have been waiting for in the Black community for a long time. And I am hopeful that we can work together in a constructive manner with my colleagues across the aisle and get this done. I am honored to be a part of the Congressional Black Caucus that has been a conscience and a voice for the American people and the conscience of this body as it continues to talk about righteousness in this nation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back to my colleagues.
Thank you for those powerful comments. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
Gentleman has 12 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield to my colleague, Representative Adams of North Carolina.
Thank you very much, and I want to first of all thank Chairman Horsford and the co-hosts, anchors for this evening, gentleman from Maryland and the gentlelady from California. I do rise today to lend my testimony to the conversation about police reform, safe communities, and the value of Black lives. The brutal beating and the death of Tyre Nichols is a reminder that we do indeed have a long way to go to solve the structural racism and the systemic police violence in America. Tyre was a son, he was a father. I am a mother and a grandmother of sons and daughters. And he had a passion for skateboarding and photography, a young person with purpose, potential, and his life was ahead of him. The Congressional Black Caucus has always been the conscience of the Congress, and that's why we're pushing for reforms to our justice system, specifically regarding the actions and the conduct of law enforcement. Because no one in this nation should fear interacting with police officers in their communities, but many Black and brown people do each and every day. Everybody wants to be safe, and we want safer communities. Tyre Nichols should still be alive today. And that's why we must address the public health epidemic of police violence that disproportionately affects our communities. Senator Tim Scott, a Republican, in his quote, was absolutely right. We've got to unite against this blatant disregard, he said, for human life, especially from those whom have been entrusted with immense power and responsibility for our communities. You know, we are keenly aware that the police are asked to handle situations sometimes that they simply aren't trained for or equipped to handle. But like many CBC members, I've been there when a police beating or shooting rocked our communities. In my home of Charlotte, North Carolina, Keith Lamont Scott was having a mental health crisis when he was shot and killed by police, leading to the first major protests and demonstrations for Black lives in our community. And that doesn't absolve the officers involved of responsibility. But what it does mean is that with better training and a different approach to policing, that Keith Lamont Scott could be alive today, and he should be. Another man, Justin Carr, lost his life during the protest. Keith Lamont Scott and Justin Carr should both still be alive today. And something's got to change to prevent further unnecessary deaths, and that's why myself and the CBC have consistently supported the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and other necessary reforms. The police culture needs to change, and it needs to change right now. And that's why the CBC is actively engaged in all relevant stakeholders with the aim of developing a legislative solution that can pass Congress and ensure meaningful police accountability reforms. For every mom and dad and son and daughter, and for every Black person, it is imperative that we deal with this issue and form some legislative solutions and some executive actions and community-based results. And that's how we can put an end to this pattern of Black lives being taken at the hand of law enforcement. And so I want to just leave you with the words of Ziana Ofant, who was 9 years old when she addressed the Charlotte City Council in the wake of the Keith Lamont Scott protests in 2006. And she said, "I feel like that we're treated differently than other people. And I don't know how we're treated, just why we're treated that way just because of our color. We are Black people, and we shouldn't have to feel like this. We shouldn't have to protest because y'all aren't treating us right. We do this because we need to, and we have rights. I was born and raised in Charlotte, and I never felt that way until now. And I can't stand how we're treated. It's a shame that our fathers and mothers are killed, and we can't even see them anymore." End of quote. 9 years old this young lady was. The truth is clear. Children can even see it. And so I hope as the CBC continues its work, more of our colleagues will see the truth as well. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
Gentleman has 7.5 minutes remaining.
I yield 2.5 minutes to the representative from New York, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the CBC for putting together this special order hour. I just want to start out by saying this is not just a CBC issue. We need the Tri-Caucus to be involved in this issue, and we need the Tri-Caucus to be speaking out on this issue. We also need action and courage from the Senate in terms of stopping the unnecessary killing of Black people throughout our country. Tyre Nichols should be alive. Trayvon Martin should be alive. Breonna Taylor should be alive. And Tatiana Jefferson, Freddie Gray, Laquan McDonald, they all should be alive. Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, on and on and on and on. Police brutality in our country is a disease that needs to be cured. It is rooted in historical racism and systematic oppression in our country. This has to stop. Federal legislation needs to be implemented to stop it. One of the things we are asking for is simple accountability. That's all. We support law enforcement when they are doing the right thing. But when they commit a crime, they should be held accountable. They are not above the law. And what's really painful is taxpayer money pays the salary of law enforcement. Taxpayer money pays the pensions of law enforcement. Taxpayer money pays for the settlements when law enforcement is sued in court. Taxpayer money pays for the lawyers. Cities go into debt using bonds to pay settlement claims. There's a billion-dollar industry of police brutality that comes out of the pockets of taxpayers. If we are going to reach the ideals of our democracy and our Constitution, we need to stop the unnecessary killing of black people in our country. And I'll close with this. It's not just policing, it's the overall system of mass incarceration. We incarcerate more, and they're disproportionately black and brown in our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to yield to my colleague, Representative Sherfullis McCormick of Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to rise today and say a special thank you to the Congressional Black Caucus, Chairman Horsford, and also my colleagues for having this special order hour. Mr. Speaker, my heart is broken for the families of Tyre Nichols, another black man who lost his life sent to senseless police overreach and violence. The horrifying footage of his untimely death displayed why the United States must pass comprehensive police reform and public safety legislation. Tyre Nichols' murder occurred in Memphis, the city where Dr. King lost his life fighting for a dream that we still are reaching for today. Our country must reckon with the long-standing and fraught legacy of racism and violence against black people. Tyre Nichols, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamar Rice, and so many more black men, women, and children should be alive today. Their deaths were preventable. Black Americans constantly find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of grief. 3 decades after this heinous beating of Rodney King, black communities continue to bear the deadly consequence of a culture of policing that allows law enforcement officials to dehumanize, debase, and victimize individuals without consequences. As a mother of 2 black children, it is heartbreaking to shoulder your kids with the responsibility of a double conscience of how you as a parent see them, but as the whole world sees them. Our black children go from being viewed as innocent to future convicts in the eyes of society and in the eyes of those who are charged with the responsibility of protecting them. It is terrifying to know that if your child will return home after they step out that door. Mothers and fathers planning their children's funerals cannot become a standard in our great nation. It is simply unacceptable. In the 117th Congress, House Democrats introduced the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, which passed the House but failed the Senate, ultimately failing all black families. In a humanitarian call for action, I urge the House to pass public safety legislation, and Mr. Speaker, I want to end by saying their names. Tyre Nichols, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamar Rice, and so many more black women, men, and children would be alive today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield the balance of our time to my colleague, Representative Sykes of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today during the first Congressional Black Caucus Special Order of the Year to stand in solidarity with the families and loved ones in support of safety and security of American citizens. Tomorrow during the State of the Union, I will be joined by Ms. Pamela Walker, a police accountability advocate and mother of Jalen Walker, a 25-year-old unarmed black man from Akron, Ohio, who was fatally shot 46 times by police in June of 2022. Jalen Walker was just 25 years old. He was a kind, quiet, and thoughtful young family man who regularly spent time with his mother, grandmother, and sister. He was just beginning to live his life with aspirations of starting his own business or becoming a professional wrestler. His mother described him as the son that every mother dreams of, talked about how proud she was to be his mother, and Ms. Walker is coming to the Capitol in honor of her son, demanding accountability, public safety, and change so that her son will not have died in vain or anyone else's son. No mother should ever have to go through what Ms. Walker experienced. Despite her unimaginable grief, she has displayed unwavering strength, dignity, and perseverance. Mr. Speaker, we must re-examine our institutions, how they operate and are governed without the polarizing rhetoric that only leads to division and not solutions. Because the longer we are divided and legislation is not passed, the more lives hang in the balance, and the public safety and security is too important to play with. We need to create a level of trust where our law enforcement officers feel like they are a part of the community, and we must also take steps to improve police accountability. There is still much work to be done to restore trust between the police and the communities they serve, and that's why I felt it was important to have Ms. Walker join me tomorrow. Let her presence signify that enough is enough. We as a nation have reached an inflection point because too many lives have been lost. I join in my colleagues in calling for robust examination of our policing, wholesale, holistic public safety policies and bipartisan national solutions to this issue before more lives are lost. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of Representative Kamlager-Dove and the Congressional Black Caucus, we thank the Speaker for this opportunity. I now yield the floor back.
The gentleman yields. What purpose does the gentleman from